Nanette Krentel prophetically told her family someone was going to burn her house down with her inside it. A few months later, a cyclist saw smoke rising from the trees in rural Lacombe, Louisiana, and called 911. When firefighters pulled what was left of Nanette from the smoldering wreckage of her home, she'd already been dead for hours, not from the fire, but from a bullet to the head. 9 surveillance cameras had been watching the property, and 30 weapons were stored in the house. Her husband was even the local fire chief, and none of it saved her. That was July 14th, 2017, and as of today, nobody has been charged with this shocking crime. Nanette Krentel was 49 years old and had been married to Steve Krentel for over 2 decades. They lived together on a sprawling, wooded 100-acre property in Lacombe, a quiet community tucked into St. Tammany Parish on Louisiana's North Shore. Steve served as the acting chief of St. Tammany Fire Protection District 12, a prominent local position that gave the family deep roots in the community. By most accounts, the family lived a relatively ordinary life in an area where people tend to know each other's business. But beneath that surface, things weren't as stable as they looked. Steve later admitted to having had an affair with a younger colleague during the marriage. Nanette's father, Dan Watson, would later tell investigators that his daughter had been considering leaving Steve before her death. Still, none of that fully explains what happened on that Friday afternoon in the middle of July, when someone put a gun to Nanette's head and then tried to erase every trace of the crime. Phone records show that Nanette's last known activity on July 14, 2017, was a call she placed to a local Kmart about a prescription refill at roughly 10 o'clock in the morning. Her final outgoing call to another person came about an hour before the 911 call. At approximately 2:30 that afternoon, a person riding their bike through the area spotted smoke billowing from the Krentel property and rode home to report it. First responders arrived to find the house engulfed, and when they made entry into the master bedroom, they discovered a body lying face up on the floor. The burns were so severe that identification wasn't immediately possible, though DNA testing would later confirm it was Nanette. Also found near the body were 2 handguns, with nearly 3 dozen additional firearms scattered throughout the ruins. Investigators from the Louisiana State Fire Marshal's office quickly determined that the fire had been intentionally set. Accelerant had been poured in multiple locations throughout the living room and master bedroom. And in what would become one of the case's most damning details, the accelerant had been specifically applied to the digital video recorder in the living room. This was the hub that stored all the footage from the 9 surveillance cameras covering the property. The recorder was so badly damaged that even FBI specialists couldn't recover any video from it, despite having some of the world's leading experts in the field work on it. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew exactly what to destroy to cover their tracks. In the immediate aftermath, the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office appeared to treat the death as if she'd done it herself. 2 weapons found near Nanette's body seemed to support that theory, and the crime scene investigation was reportedly discontinued in the early stages. But 5 days later, ballistic testing proved that neither weapon found near her had been fired. The scene was cordoned off again, and the investigation shifted tremendously. On September 14th, 2017, exactly 2 months after her death, the St. Tammany Parish coroner officially ruled Nanette's death a slaying. His reasoning was direct and difficult to dispute. There was no soot in her airway, not even at a microscopic level. That absence made a powerful case that Nanette was already dead before the fire ever started. Unfortunately, ballistics testing couldn't provide such cut-and-dried clues, both due to the physics of the bullet and the fire itself. The bullet had entered her temple, and it hadn't exited her skull, instead lodging in soft tissue. The intense heat of the fire complicated ballistic analysis significantly and investigators eventually determined that it was likely, though not certainly, from a .40 caliber handgun. However, this analysis was informed by the fact that Nanette typically carried one of these in her purse, suggesting the attacker may have turned her own weapon against her. Unfortunately, this was educated guesswork, and ultimately the forensic team couldn't definitively determine whose gun it actually was. In homicide cases, the spouse is always the first person investigators look at, and Steve Krentel was no exception. He had motive on paper: the admitted affair, a marriage that might have been ending, and the fact that he held a position of trust and respect in the community. But here's the thing: despite this apparent motive, there was absolutely nothing whatsoever to link him to the crime. Steve completely cooperated with the investigation from the start. He submitted to a polygraph test and passed, and he had an alibi. He was at the fire station at the time of the incident. He was publicly ruled out as a person of interest in the case. Steve would later resign from his position as fire chief amid separate revelations about inappropriate relationships with multiple staff members. His personal life was messy, without question, but that didn't make him guilty. Far from it. If Steve Krentel was the obvious suspect, his brother Brian was the one Nanette herself had been afraid of. In the months and years before her death, Nanette sent a stream of emails to her father in Iowa, warning him about the danger she believed Brian posed. Brian Krentel had a lengthy criminal record and a history of volatile behavior. According to family members, he'd made explicit threats against Nanette, including a threat to burn the home down with her inside. In fact, Nanette had learned to shoot specifically because she was afraid of Brian. She'd pushed for the installation of the 9 surveillance cameras around the property. She'd also been counting on a geofence, an electronic monitoring boundary, that was supposed to alert Brian's probation officer if he came within 1,000 feet of the Krentel home. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. After Nanette's death, Steve recorded a conversation with Brian's probation officer. The probation officer admitted to him, apparently off the record, that the tracking function on Brian's ankle monitor wasn't working that day. The one safeguard Nanette was relying on to keep her brother-in-law away from her home had never been active at the material time. Now with all this, you're probably expecting me to say that there's just simply not enough evidence to charge Brian. But that's where yet another twist comes in. Despite all of this, Brian was officially cleared, and for very good reason. Surveillance evidence from Brian's parents' house placed him with his parents, about 15 miles away, on the date and time Nanette died. The St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office has never publicly named him as a person of interest or a suspect. If the case itself is disturbing, the investigation that followed has been nearly as troubling. Nanette's family grew increasingly vocal about what they saw as a lack of urgency and transparency from the sheriff's office, and they weren't the only ones who noticed. In 2019, a man named Jerry Rogers, federal investigator with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and a former employee of the sheriff's office, was arrested. His crime, according to law enforcement, was sending a series of anonymous emails to Nanette's sister, Kim Watson, in which he criticized the lead detective on the case. Rogers had created an email address specifically for the purpose of contacting people close to the case. The arrest itself became a scandal, and a federal judge later ruled that Rogers had been illegally arrested, finding that the sheriff's deputies had violated his civil rights. The Louisiana Attorney General declined to prosecute. Court filings revealed that an FBI agent had requested a criminal probe into the sheriff's office over what was described as a possible police conspiracy related to the case. Now, it's important to note here that this quote-unquote police conspiracy is simply alleged and has never been confirmed as a fact, but the allegation was made by federal law enforcement. That said, nothing came of it. So take that allegation with a grain of salt, since it may simply be an unproven allegation without any meaningful evidence to back it up. The sheriff's office ultimately settled Rogers' federal civil rights lawsuit for an undisclosed amount. Sheriff Smith, for his part, pushed back on the criticism, suggesting at various points that the case had been weaponized for political reasons. But for Nanette's family, none of the political noise changed the central, agonizing reality. The person who ended the life of their loved one was still free. The FBI was eventually given access to the full case file and has been reanalyzing evidence and information gathered during the investigation. As of right now, all we know is that someone, for some reason, walked onto that 100-acre property in broad daylight and shot an innocent woman in the head. The perpetrator then doused her home in accelerant, destroyed the one device that might have captured them on camera, and set the whole thing ablaze. Then, just like that, they walked away, and nearly a decade later, they're still walking free. In the end, Nanette Krentel predicted exactly how she would die, which in retrospect may simply be a bizarre coincidence, because the person she feared couldn't have done the crime. In my analysis, the early handling of Nanette Krentel's death appears to have shaped the entire trajectory of the investigation, potentially with irreversible consequences. When authorities initially approached the scene under the assumption that she had caused her own death, the urgency and rigor typically applied may not have been fully activated. Critical steps, such as preserving the scene, documenting evidence thoroughly, and immediately pursuing forensic leads, could have been delayed or deprioritized. In cases involving fire, where evidence is already fragile and easily destroyed, even small lapses in procedure can have outsized effects. The destruction of the surveillance system only compounded this vulnerability, eliminating what may have been the most direct path to identifying a suspect. If key evidence was overlooked or compromised in those first crucial hours, it will likely never be recovered, if it could have been recovered regardless. As a result, the case risks remaining permanently unresolved, perhaps not for lack of effort, but because the foundation of the investigation was weakened at the very beginning. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, jumping in as usual to remind you to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you're enjoying my content. Now with that said, we've got a lot of unsolved mysteries to get through, so let's get back to business. On the morning of February 28, 2019, Alicia Griffin picked up her phone, spoke with her husband Martin Haupt, and told him she'd be heading to her doctor's appointment. It was a mundane promise, the kind you make 100 times and never think twice about. But she never made it to that appointment. Within 72 hours, Alicia would travel hundreds of miles south from Sacramento to the Mexican border. She abandoned her father's car in Tijuana, with her purse and identification still inside, and vanished from the face of the earth. What happened in those 3 days is a question law enforcement has been trying to answer for years, and the few clues that do exist only make the whole thing more disturbing. Alicia was 46 years old, living in Sacramento, California at the time of her disappearance. She'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1 in her mid-20s, a condition she'd managed for over 2 decades, and by all accounts, she was in a hopeful period of her life. She'd recently married Martin Haupt, a man who was in the process of relocating from Switzerland to Sacramento to build their life together. The future seemed like it was opening up for her, not closing down, but there was a complicating factor. In the weeks before she disappeared, Alicia had undergone a change in her medication, an adjustment to the prescriptions she relied on to manage her mental health. Those close to her have noted that she'd had previous episodes where she'd wander away from home without warning. It was a known pattern, a feature of her illness that the people around her had learned to watch for. But this time, That pattern would become devastatingly relevant in ways no one could have anticipated. After missing her doctor's appointment on the morning of February 28th, Alicia didn't just stay home or go somewhere local. She got in her father's car and began driving south, apparently in the grip of a mental health crisis. Over the next 2 days, she covered the distance from Sacramento all the way down to the Mexican border, a journey of roughly 500 miles. During this time, the people in her life began receiving unsettling signals. Friends and family reported cryptic text messages from Alicia's phone, the kind that didn't sound quite right, along with unusual charges appearing on her credit cards. Something was clearly wrong, but the most alarming moment came from a phone call placed from a hotel near Los Angeles International Airport. During that call, someone close to Alicia could hear a man's voice in the background, a voice that didn't belong to anyone they recognized. He had apparently instructed Alicia to go to a bank machine and withdraw money, a disturbing incident that suggests she was under the control of someone who was taking advantage of her. Who that man was has never been publicly identified, and his role in the events that followed remains one of the case's most troubling unknowns. On March 1st, Alicia was spotted near the airport in Inglewood, California, and by the next day, March 2nd, she'd crossed the border into Mexico. Her dad's vehicle was found abandoned at a car wash in Tijuana, and inside it were her purse and her identification documents. A witness at the car wash later told investigators that they'd seen Alicia there and that she'd been acting erratically. This account lined up with the theory that she was in the middle of a severe mental health episode, but it also deepened the mystery. Why Tijuana? Was she following some internal logic that only made sense to her in that state? Or was she being led there by someone else? The Sacramento Police Department took the lead on the case, and Martin Haupt was investigated as a person of interest, which is standard practice when a spouse goes missing. He was cleared by authorities and has been cooperating with the investigation ever since. The focus then shifted to tracing Alicia's movements in Mexico, and there's some conflict on what was actually found. There's an unconfirmed report that a Mexican detective managed to identify Alicia on surveillance footage from a store located a few miles from the car wash where her vehicle was found. However, I wasn't able to independently verify this, and the footage is nowhere to be found online. Not even a still frame. Nothing. That said, it may be true, and perhaps it's available in some Spanish language source that I don't have access to. Alicia's family, unwilling to accept the silence, hired a private investigator to continue digging where official resources might fall short. That effort, unfortunately, didn't turn up any new leads either. The case sits in a painful limbo. There's no evidence that Alicia is dead, but there's no evidence she's alive. She's listed as a missing person with both the California Department of Justice and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. The Sacramento Police Department's Missing Persons Unit continues to work the case, but publicly available updates have been scarce for years. There are a few ways to read the evidence, and none of them are comforting. The first and perhaps most straightforward theory is that Alicia was in the throes of a bipolar episode, potentially triggered or worsened by her medication change. During this time, she made a series of irrational decisions that led her across the border and into a dangerous situation. Tijuana can be an unforgiving city for anyone, and it's an especially dangerous place for a woman in the middle of a psychiatric crisis. In this scenario, Alicia may have met with foul play after arriving in Mexico, taken advantage of by someone who recognized her vulnerability. The second theory, and the one that haunts her family the most, centers on the mysterious man heard during the hotel phone call near the airport. If someone was directing Alicia to withdraw money, that suggests exploitation at a minimum and something far darker at worst. Was she being manipulated by someone who recognized her compromised mental state? Was she trafficked? The presence of an unidentified man giving her financial instructions is the kind of detail that turns a missing persons case into something that feels more genuinely sinister. The fact that this individual has never been identified publicly only adds to the unease. A third possibility, less discussed but worth noting, is that Alicia is still alive somewhere, either unable or unwilling to make contact. People experiencing severe psychiatric episodes have, in rare cases, established entirely new routines in unfamiliar places, sometimes not resurfacing for months or even years. Without her identification, she could be living anonymously, possibly unaware of the search being conducted on her behalf. It's the most hopeful scenario, but with each passing year, it becomes harder to sustain. It's possible that she feels a deep sense of embarrassment or shame about the actions she took during the time she was experiencing a psychiatric episode. If that's the case, I would just hope she comes to the realization that this was a medical episode and not something to be ashamed of. But that said, given the amount of time she's been missing now, this is sadly looking like a much less likely possibility. Alicia Griffin's case sits at the intersection of mental health, possible criminal exploitation, and the particular dangers that come with crossing an international border while in crisis. Her story doesn't have the massive dramatic twists that tend to generate extensive media coverage, which may be part of the problem. Cases like hers can slip through the cracks of public attention, remembered primarily by the people who loved her and the investigators who haven't given up. Her case is still open with the Sacramento Police Department, and neither her family or investigators are willing to give up on Alicia. $70,000 in jewelry, $4,000 in cash, both still on the bodies. Whatever happened in that driveway on the morning of March 16, 1988, it wasn't a robbery. It was an execution, methodical, coordinated, efficient, and deeply, unmistakably personal. And the man most people believe ordered it wouldn't see the inside of a courtroom for nearly 2 decades. To understand why Mickey Thompson's death sent shockwaves through the motorsport world, you have to understand who he was. And who he was defies easy summary. Born Marion Thompson on December 7th, 1928, in Alhambra, California, Mickey was the kind of person who looked at a junkyard and saw a land speed record. By 14, he'd bought his first car, a 1927 Chevy, for $7.50. Before he was old enough to legally drive, he was racing home-built machines on the dry lake beds of Southern California. By his early 20s, Thompson was working as a journalist at the Los Angeles Times, while pouring every spare hour into hot rodding. In 1955, he designed and introduced what became known as the slingshot dragster, a configuration that placed the driver behind the rear axle and fundamentally changed the sport. But the achievement that made Mickey Thompson a household name came on September 9, 1960, at Utah's Bonneville Salt Flats. Behind the wheel of Challenger 1, a remarkable 4-engine machine he'd built largely from salvage parts, Thompson hit a one-way speed of 406.60 miles per hour. He became the first person to break the 400-mile-per-hour barrier, and he'd surpassed a mark that had stood since 1947. There was just one problem. Official speed records require 2 consecutive runs in opposite directions. A mechanical failure on the return pass meant the record was never formally certified, but it didn't matter. In the eyes of the racing world, Mickey Thompson was the fastest man in America. Over the following decades, Thompson accumulated an almost absurd range of accomplishments, and he set 295 speed records at Bonneville alone. He entered cars at the Indianapolis 500. He participated in over 10,000 races across his career, winning numerous championships. In 1971, Thompson married Trudy Feller, a former secretary at Hot Rod magazine. The wedding was pure Mickey. He chartered 3 jets to carry 250 guests from Long Beach to Las Vegas. Trudy wasn't just along for the ride, though. She became Mickey's full business partner, and together they formed the Mickey Thompson Entertainment Group, known as MTEG. The venture effectively took indoor motocross and off-road racing out of the backcountry and into major metropolitan stadiums and arenas. MTEG staged crowd-pleasing events at venues like the Anaheim Stadium and the 80,000-seat Pontiac Silverdome. By the mid-1980s, it was one of the hottest promotions in motorsport entertainment. And it was this successful venture that would ultimately bring Mickey Thompson into the orbit of the man who'd arrange his death. On April 1st, 1984, Mickey Thompson signed a stock transfer agreement with a motorsport promoter named Michael Goodwin. The deal combined their business interests, with profits and losses split 70-30 in Goodwin's favor. The first events under the partnership, shows at the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis and the Silverdome in Michigan, lost money, which isn't unusual for new ventures. But what happened next set the tone for everything that followed. Goodwin came to Thompson asking for $60,000 to cover bills from the Indiana event. Thompson paid. Then Goodwin asked for another $17,000 from Michigan, and Thompson paid that too. Multiple witnesses would later testify that Goodwin, for his part, didn't contribute his share of anything. By October of 1984, Thompson had had enough, and he took the matter to court. The judge dissolved the partnership and returned control of MTEG to Thompson, but the legal battle was far from over. In May of 1986, a California court ruled that Michael Goodwin had stolen more than $500,000 from the partnership and awarded Thompson $514,000 in damages. This is a figure that would eventually grow to nearly $1 million with interest and penalties. Goodwin, for his part, refused to pay. He didn't just refuse once. He refused repeatedly, defiantly, and with increasing hostility. What emerged during the eventual trial painted a picture that's hard to dismiss as coincidence. Roughly 15 different people would testify that they'd heard Goodwin talk openly about wanting Mickey Thompson dead. According to witness testimony, he'd said he'd rather see Thompson in the ground than pay him a dime. He reportedly told at least 2 people the specific cost he believed it would take to have Thompson eliminated. These weren't whispered confessions shared in private either. He was very open about it. They were repeated, almost casual declarations made openly over a period of approximately 2 years leading up to March of 1988. It was still early on a Wednesday morning, around 6 o'clock, when Mickey and Trudy Thompson stepped out of their home in the gated community of Bradbury. This is a quiet community, nestled in the San Gabriel Valley foothills, east of Los Angeles, and definitely not the sort of place where violence often occurs. They were headed to their offices at Anaheim Stadium, the same commute they made most days. Mickey opened the garage door for Trudy to pull out in her vehicle, then walked toward his own car. 2 hooded gunmen were waiting. They shot Mickey first, wounding him, then dragged him out into the driveway. One of the attackers went after Trudy as she attempted to back out in the couple's van. Then, with Trudy gone, the second gunman walked back up the driveway to where the first was standing over Mickey and shot him fatally in the head. The assailants fled the scene on bicycles they'd ridden to the residence. A neighbor who heard the commotion reported seeing 2 men in their 20s, approximately 6 feet tall, pedaling away from the property. Investigators arriving at the scene found the Thompsons' bodies with all their valuables untouched. A stun gun that didn't belong to the victims was recovered nearby. Robbery was immediately ruled out. Whoever did this came with a single purpose, and a single purpose only. From the very beginning, investigators looked hard at Michael Goodwin. The financial motive was obvious, the threats were well documented, and Goodwin's behavior in the months surrounding the slayings raised serious red flags. 2 months before the Thompsons were eliminated, Goodwin and his wife had purchased $275,000 worth of gold coins. They'd also wired approximately $400,000 to banks on Grand Turk Island in the Caribbean. 5 months after the Thompsons' deaths, the Goodwins left the United States on their yacht and didn't return for more than 2 years. But suspicion isn't evidence, and for years the case stalled. The two gunmen were never identified, and in fact, never were. There was no physical evidence tying Goodwin directly to the crime scene, and no weapon was ever recovered. The investigation ground forward in fits and starts, with Los Angeles County Sheriff's Detective Mark Lilienfeld leading the charge. In 1998, Lilienfeld sought to have Goodwin charged, but the effort stalled, potentially held back by Goodwin's wealth and political connections. He eventually took his case to the Orange County District Attorney's Office, which secured an indictment against Goodwin in 2001 following a raid on Goodwin's home. Even then, the road to trial was long, and it wasn't until late 2006 that Michael Goodwin finally sat in a courtroom to answer for what happened in that Bradbury driveway. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial, and they acknowledged as much. There was no genetic evidence, no fingerprints, and no one was arguing that Goodwin was the trigger man. What they had instead was a mountain of testimony, 15 witnesses who'd heard Goodwin threaten to have Thompson eliminated. They also had financial records showing suspicious asset movement, and evidence that Goodwin had been spotted in the Thompsons' neighborhood with binoculars. These were damning facts for the man who owed Mickey Thompson nearly $1 million and swore he'd sooner see him dead than follow the court order. On January 4, 2007, after nearly 19 years of investigation, a jury found Michael Frank Goodwin guilty. In March of that year, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Goodwin appealed, and in 2015, the California 2nd District Court of Appeal upheld the conviction, describing the body of circumstantial evidence as overwhelming. The 2 men who actually pulled the triggers on that Wednesday morning in 1988 have never been identified and never faced any consequences for what they did. Despite the conviction of the man believed to have ordered the hit, the operational details of the crime remain an unsolved mystery. Perhaps the most unsettling thing is how these shooters were recruited, but whatever the case, Goodwin never talked. Personally, I think this may indicate that the hitmen were retained through an organized criminal syndicate. Otherwise, I can see no other reason why Goodwin wouldn't have flipped on them, especially after his appeals ran out. There's also the matter of the stun gun found at the scene. It didn't belong to the Thompsons, and its presence has never been fully explained. It's entirely possible that Goodwin hadn't actually ordered a hit, but rather, an abduction of the couple. He seems like a rather sick individual, so perhaps he wanted to finish the job himself, rather than have the couple shot in their driveway. After all, this is a guy who owned a yacht, and could have taken them out into international waters, where their dumped bodies would almost certainly never have been found. But that's just completely speculative on my part, though I do think it's actually quite plausible. Claudia Lawrence was a 35-year-old chef from York, England, who vanished in 2009. Born on February 27, 1974 in the town of Malton, she grew up in North Yorkshire and later settled in the Heworth area of York. She worked as a cook at the University of York and was considered reliable and hardworking. Claudia lived alone in a home in Heworth and was close to her family. Her father, Peter, was a lawyer, and her mother, Joan, had been a local mayor. She was sociable and independent, often spending evenings at a local pub with friends. Claudia had never married and had no children, but she maintained what has euphemistically been called a quote-unquote active social life. She had a series of romantic relationships, including some with men who were married or involved with others. She was discreet about these liaisons, a fact that would later draw significant media attention after she disappeared. On March 18, 2009, Claudia followed her usual routine. She worked an early shift and was captured on CCTV heading home around 3 p.m. That evening, she spoke with both of her parents by phone and sounded cheerful and normal. She even made plans for the upcoming Mother's Day with her mom, and she said she was going to bed early because of her next day's early shift. Also, just a quick programming note, Mother's Day in the UK falls on the fourth Sunday of Lent, rather than in May. Her car was in the garage for repairs, so she would be walking to work. Claudia sent her last known text at 8:23 p.m. and received a reply at 9:12 p.m. After that, no one heard from her again, but there's significant evidence that she would attempt to get to work the following morning, but I'll come back to that. When Claudia didn't show up for her 6 a.m. shift on March 19th, her colleagues became alarmed. She wasn't the type to miss work without warning. Later that day, she also failed to meet a friend at their local pub as planned, and calls to her phone went unanswered. By the next day, her family's concern had turned to panic after her friends raised the alarm. That afternoon, her father went to her house to check on her, accompanied by a family friend with a spare key. Inside, everything was in place and there were no signs of a struggle. The bed was neatly made and a few dishes were in the sink, suggesting she had eaten before heading out. Crucially, her handbag, containing her wallet, bank cards, and passport, was left behind. However, her cell phone was missing, as was the blue and gray backpack that held her chef's uniform. It appeared she had left for work as usual early on March 19th, but never arrived. Peter Lawrence contacted North Yorkshire Police to report his daughter missing, and a full investigation began. Initially, the police saw no immediate evidence of foul play and treated Claudia's disappearance as a routine missing person case. They considered the possibility that she might have left on her own, but her friends and family insisted she would never vanish without telling anyone. As days passed with no sign of her, the voluntary disappearance idea became less likely. Officers searched along her walking route for any clues of an accident or abduction and found nothing. In the first weeks, hundreds of police personnel and volunteers scoured the area, making door-to-door inquiries and combing the area extensively, but no trace of Claudia turned up. There was also no activity on her bank accounts after she went missing. By late April 2009, about 5 weeks after she vanished, the case was reclassified as a suspected slaying inquiry, reflecting the growing fear that Claudia had been harmed by someone. Detectives explored various scenarios in the early stages. They looked into whether a stranger might have attacked Claudia during her pre-dawn walk, but no evidence supported the theory of a random assailant. Some tips about suspicious people in the area led nowhere, and checks on known offenders in the region revealed no connection. With those leads exhausted, investigators turned their focus to people in Claudia's life. The case drew nationwide attention almost immediately. Given her ties to Cyprus, and that the last text she received was from a friend there, officers traveled there to interview friends she had met on holiday. However, they found no evidence that Claudia had left the country or that anyone overseas was involved. Back in York, detectives interviewed dozens of people who knew Claudia and dug into the details of her personal life. They learned she had been involved in multiple relationships, some of which weren't publicly known to her friends and family. Police theorized that someone close to her, perhaps a lover, ex-partner, or the angry partner of someone she knew, might have had a personal motive to harm her. They compiled a timeline of her recent social contacts and activities. Some individuals were hesitant to fully cooperate, possibly out of fear or a desire to keep certain matters private. In 2013, new forensic techniques were applied to the case, and these developments led to a series of arrests in 2014 and 2015. In May 2014, a 59-year-old local man was arrested on suspicion of Claudia's slaying. He was a former work colleague who lived near Claudia's home and had occasionally given her a lift. Police searched his properties but ultimately found no evidence to charge him, and he was released. Over the next year, several other men in their 50s were arrested, including a pub landlord and a few of the men who socialized with Claudia. Some were held on suspicion of the slaying, and others for allegedly hiding information. Each arrest led to extensive searches and interviews. However, as with the first suspect, nothing definitive could be pinned on any of them. By 2017, a total of 9 people had been arrested over the course of the inquiry, yet no one was charged, and Claudia was still missing. The theory most favored by police is that Claudia was slain by someone she knew. The narrow window of time during her routine walk and the lack of any signs of struggle or robbery suggest she likely encountered a familiar person. Most victims know their perpetrator, which also supports this line of thinking. Under this scenario, the perp may have approached her in a non-threatening way, perhaps offering a ride or engaging in conversation. This could explain why no one reported witnessing anything unusual on the morning in question. After all, people are seen getting in and out of vehicles all the time, and the only way that sort of event would stick out is if there was something truly bizarre or unusual about the interaction. Others speculate that she was slain by someone she had an affair with, or by the spouse of one of these individuals. In the former case, it's been speculated that the individual may have viewed Claudia as a liability and eliminated her. In the latter case, some have alternatively speculated that the slaying may have been a professional job, and that Claudia may have been brought to a site where she was finished off. Another possibility is that Claudia fell victim to an unknown attacker in a random crime. Investigators considered the scenario of a stranger abduction, but they found little evidence for it. Speculation about known serial offenders was explored due to some coincidental similarities, but no connection was ever established. Likewise, the idea that Claudia chose to disappear on her own has been firmly rejected by both police and her family. She left behind all her important belongings and had made plans for the near future. It's now been more than 15 years since Claudia vanished, and if she's alive, she'd be in her early 50s. That said, investigators firmly believe that she isn't alive, and that she was likely slain on the day she vanished. For now, the disappearance of Claudia Lawrence continues to remain one of Britain's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Imagine a plant so valuable its resin was guarded like a gold mine and its image was minted on every coin. It wasn't a rare spice or a common grain, but a wild golden-flowered herb that refused to be tamed. This was silphium, the ancient world's most coveted botanical mystery, a wonder that allegedly cured everything from a simple cough to life-threatening illnesses. It was so precious that Julius Caesar once kept 1,500 pounds of it in the Roman treasury, yet by the time the 1st century AD drew to a close, it had vanished from the earth. The story of silphium is the first recorded instance of humans driving a species to extinction through greed and neglect. The legend began in 631 BC, when Greek settlers arrived in Cyrenaica, located in modern-day Libya. They found a narrow strip of land where silphium grew wild, thriving after a mysterious pitch-black rain had supposedly soaked the soil. For centuries, the citizens of Cyrene guarded their meadows, as their most vital source of revenue. This botanical fluke turned Cyrene into an economic powerhouse. Because the plant only grew in a specific 125-mile wide region and resisted all attempts at cultivation, the Greeks held a global monopoly. They managed the harvest like a high-stakes mining operation, setting strict quotas to ensure they didn't deplete the wild population. The plant's resin became a cornerstone of trade, sold for its weight in silver. Cyrene's kings, the Batiads, grew fabulously wealthy by exporting this sap across the Mediterranean. The plant was so central to their survival that it appeared on the front of their coins, often relegated to a position higher than the gods themselves. This has led some to believe that the plant was so revered by the populace that it was actually personified and then deified. For centuries, if you had silphium, you had the riches of the world, along with the power that came with that. In the kitchen, silphium was the ultimate luxury seasoning. Stalks were roasted or boiled like vegetables, while roots were dipped in vinegar, but the true prize was the milky resin. After being tapped from the plant, the sap was mixed with flour to prevent decay and shipped in small blocks. It had a complex sulfurous aroma that supposedly left a pleasant fragrance on the breath. Medicinally, it was regarded as a miracle panacea. Pliny the Elder recorded nearly 40 remedies, suggesting it could treat indigestion, epilepsy, and even snake bites. It was used as a topical salve for wounds, a cure for sore throats, and a way to remove warts. Hippocrates even recommended it for gut issues, while others thought it could cure baldness. The plant's most famous use, however, was in reproductive health. It was highly prized as a contraceptive. Women would take a pea-sized amount of the resin once a month to prevent conception or manage their cycles. This widespread use meant that silphium was deeply connected to the themes of love and intimacy, and many historians believe this is where our modern heart symbol originated. On silver coins from Cyrene, these heart-shaped seed pods are displayed prominently, providing a visual link between the plant's biological form and its cultural meaning. Even the poet Catullus referenced silphium-bearing Cyrene when writing about the infinite number of kisses he wanted to share with his lover. This poetic interlude highlights how the plant permeated the romantic imagination of the ancient elite. Despite its fame, silphium's exact botanical identity remains a mystery. Since it vanished before modern science could classify it, we're left with ancient descriptions and coin imagery. It's generally agreed that the plant belonged to the genus Ferula, making it a relative of giant fennel or celery. It had a thick, grooved stalk and umbrella-like yellow flower clusters. Some scientists have proposed species like Ferula tingitana or Thapsia gumifera, but these don't quite match the medicinal potency described by authors like Pliny. Recently, a Turkish scientist identified Ferula drudiana in Turkey as a possible candidate, noting its heart-shaped seeds and unique chemical compounds. This sparked a new wave of interest, because he found it growing near ancient Greek villages in Anatolia. This suggested it may have been brought there by settlers who hoped to save it from extinction. While this find is exciting, many remain skeptical, because the plant is native to Anatolia rather than Libya. The tragedy of silphium's extinction is a cautionary tale for our own age. When Rome took control of the region, the pressure for short-term profit began to erode the sustainable practices of the Greeks. Greedy tax farmers ignored harvest limits, while sheep farmers discovered that silphium-fed meat was a culinary sensation. Overgrazing became a massive problem, as sheep ate the young plants before they could produce seeds. This wasn't just about overconsumption, though. Massive deforestation for agriculture and timber changed the local microclimate, leading to rapid desertification. The plant was incredibly sensitive to soil conditions, and likely required a specific cycle of cold temperatures to germinate. As the landscape dried and the forests vanished, the conditions for silphium's survival disappeared. By the time of the Emperor Nero, only one stalk remained in Cyrenaica. It was harvested and sent to him as a curiosity, marking the quiet end of a species that had once bankrolled a kingdom. It's a sobering reminder that even the most precious resources aren't infinite. While we may never taste the resin that Caesar valued more than gold, the legacy of silphium survives in every heart-shaped token of affection we share, even if we didn't know it. It's a silent tribute to a plant that was once the pulse of an entire world.